I think Aesop, the ancient storyteller, the slave storyteller, was able to tell his stories because he knew of human experience as an experience of suffering. And he said that it's death that gives the historian their license. Also in 1940, one of Elizabeth Bowen's characters in a story she wrote said, "Now there's enough death to challenge being alive. We're facing it anyway that we don't live. We're confronted by the impossibility of living unless we can break through into something else." She's writing in the midst of war. There's so much death around her, it causes her to think, how am I living? What am I doing in my life? And the blitz over London, the fires, brought this to her mind. And she saw a vast illumination that destroyed the darkness that she was living in. And it's this urgency that she expressed that I began to feel after the 11th of September 2001. You remember Joan Didion said in her reaction to the slaughter of the Twin Towers and the subsequent lie, she spoke of the troublingly belligerent idealization of historical ignorance that she found around her in North America, in the United States, in the reaction to 9/11. And the conservative intellectuals had prepared us, Alan Bloom, Gertrude Himmelfarb, for this historical ignorance. Search the American Mind by Bloom for the word Magna Carta, and you will be on a futile task. Search Gertrude Himmelfarb in her books on Victorian England for the phrase the freeborn Englishman, and you will be on a futile task. You will not find Magna Carta, habeas corpus, the prohibition of torture, due process of law in the work of these conservative intellectuals writing about the, quote, Anglo-Protestant tradition. I mention this because I want to I won't play games here. Because what happened to me in October 2001 as a scholar is that I was listening, had my television on, and was listening to President Bush address two houses of the United States Congress. And he invited Prime Minister Tony Blair over to listen. And he said, "We are fighting for freedom." You remember? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And I waited. And I waited. I waited for somebody, some white hair, some old soldier who would remember that there are four freedoms. If you're going to compare Tony Blair to Winston Churchill, if you're going to compare yourself to Franklin Roosevelt, if you're going to conjure up World War II, what did they call it? The Great Generation? Or what was that expression? Then at least you can give us the four freedoms. But nobody had remembered because they had passed. Memory was gone, and before my ears and eyes, history was being rewritten. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, but the other four freedoms of World War II, of 1940, of the breakthrough of 1940, were not expressed. It was on the 6th of January 1941 that Franklin Roosevelt summarized what he had learned from the Battle of Britain, while the bombs were still falling, before Coventry had been bombed. He was summarizing why are the democracies fighting, and he summarized it in his State of the Union address as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom from fear, and freedom from want. It's those two from freedoms that George Bush refused to name. And then Franklin Roosevelt, 2 weeks later, gave his third inaugural address. And he wrote that the spirit, the faith of America, is the product of centuries. Oh, I wish I could talk like he talked. It was born in the multitudes of those who came from many lands, some of high degree, but mostly plain people, who sought here, early and late, to find freedom more freely. The democratic aspiration, Franklin Roosevelt is teaching, is no mere recent phrase in history. It is human history. It permeated the ancient life of early peoples. It blazed anew in the Middle Ages. It was written in Magna Carta. He said, in the midst of this build-up to the U.S. entry to the war, in the midst of the destruction of Europe, with only England left, he says, in the midst of swift happenings, it's time to pause for a moment and to take stock, to recall what our place in history has been, and to rediscover what we are and what we may be. If we do not, we risk the real peril of isolation. Do you see? He's saying if we forget our past, then we are isolationists. He's not saying if we forget the other countries in the world, we're isolationists. Interesting, isn't it? Of course, they're linked. He wants us in the third inaugural to remember Magna Carta. And then a few weeks later, in 1941, he wrote, or he spoke to the White House correspondents. He said, I spoke of 4 freedoms. They may not be immediately attainable throughout the world, but humanity does not move forward toward those glorious ideals through democratic processes. And if we fail, if democracy is superseded by slavery, 1941, the most advanced technological machines in the world, the V-2, V-1 rockets are being produced by slave labor in the Hartz Mountains at the time that Roosevelt was speaking. Slavery is not an idle rhetorical expression in 1941. It's a worldwide phenomenon, and slave masters have overrun Europe. And if we fail, if democracy is superseded by slavery, then those 4 freedoms, or even the mention of them, will become forbidden things. So that's what I took from 1940 in 2001. That's what we must take. Let's pause ourselves. George Bush in October 1941 is able to lie to us and say, to deny 2 of the 4 freedoms and have us off to war in Afghanistan. The dogs of war are yapping into Iraq. And meanwhile, I wonder, what is Magna Carta? What is freedom from want?